England, 1822. The Duke of Leon had everything a man of his rank could possess: a title, a fortune, 12,000 acres of the finest land in Wiltshire. What he did not have, what no amount of money or rank could buy him, was peace. His wife was gone. His twins had not slept a full night in 2 years. And the guilt he carried for what he had failed to do before she died, that, he had decided, was his to keep forever. Into this broken, beautiful house came Sophie Mercer, a housemaid. Nobody. The kind of woman a great house swallows whole and never notices. Until the night she sat on the floor of his children's room and sang them a lullaby. A song no one had taught her. A song she could not explain. A song that had belonged to his dead wife. How did a stranger come to carry the one thing that could reach his children? And quietly, impossibly, begin to reach him. Subscribe and stay. This is only the beginning. England, spring of 1822. That is not a misprint. The year is 1822, not 1813, not 1814, not the season everyone else writes about. When drawing rooms were full of Bonaparte's name and young men still had the nervous, freshly shaved look of soldiers recently returned. No, this is a later England, a quieter England. The wars are over. The grief is different now. It is domestic. It is private. It lives behind closed doors and enormous iron gates and long gravel drives, where the stones are kept immaculate, because immaculate stones are the only thing a man can still control. The Duke of Lyon's country seat, Ashvale Park, Wiltshire, was one such place. The gravel was always raked. The hedgerows were always cut. The footmen's uniforms were always pressed with the precision of a military regiment, though none of them had ever held a musket. Order was maintained at Ashvale Park the way it is maintained in houses where something terrible has happened. Obsessively, fiercely, as though neatness might hold back whatever dark tide waits just beyond the garden wall. Tristan Edward Cavendish de Lyon, 6th Duke of Lyon, was 35 years old in the spring of 1822, and he was, by almost every measure available to English society, ruined. Not financially. His coffers were full, his estates productive, his investments in the northern mills returning extraordinary dividends. Not politically. He still held his seat, still received invitations to dinners he no longer attended. Not even socially, exactly, for the Tun had an enormous capacity for tolerating the eccentricities of titled men. He was ruined in the way that matters most, and is spoken of least, on the inside, where it counts. His wife, Eleanor, born Eleanor Graves, youngest daughter of the Earl of Strathmere, had died in the spring of 1820, 2 years before our story begins. She had not died in childbirth, as people in London whispered when they thought no one from Ashvale was listening. She had died of a long illness, a slow and terrible unravelling that had begun in the winter of 1818, when Eleanor was 26 and her twins, Oliver and Iris, were barely 2 years old. She had lasted another 16 months. Tristan had watched every one of them. And therein lay the wound that would not close. He had not watched all of them. The final 3 months, January through March of 1820, when Eleanor moved from ill to dying, when the light left her eyes by degrees like a lamp running out of oil. Those months Tristan had spent in London, managing the estate accounts, he told himself, seeing to parliamentary matters that could not wait. The truth, which he had never said aloud to anyone, and which sat in his chest like a stone placed there by a surgeon and never removed, was that he had been afraid. He had not wanted to watch her go, and so he had gone instead. And by the time he returned to Wiltshire in late March, Eleanor had already said her last coherent words, and they had not been to him. He never spoke of this. He never would. Oliver and Iris de Lyon were 4 years old now, in 1822, and they were, there is no polite way to say this, ungovernable. Not in the way that spoiled children are ungovernable, demanding sweets and stamping small feet. They were ungovernable in the way that grieving creatures are ungovernable, wildly, unpredictably, from somewhere so deep inside them that no nurse or governess or concerned grandmother could reach it. They had nightmares, both of them, Every night, like clockwork, as though they had agreed upon it. They would begin crying somewhere around the second hour after midnight, and the crying would escalate into screaming, and the screaming would wake the entire east wing of Ashvale Park, and every adult in that wing would try something: warm milk, cold cloths, soft voices, firm voices, candles, darkness, songs, silence, and nothing, not a single thing, would work until the twins exhausted themselves back into sleep. 11 nurses had come and gone in 2 years. A physician from Bath had visited twice and prescribed laudanum, which Tristan had thrown into the fireplace still in its bottle. A woman from the village who claimed some knowledge of children's humours had been brought up to the house and had lasted 4 days before quietly departing. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had sat with the children on 3 separate occasions and had declared them, on each one, perfectly healthy and merely difficult. Which was the kind of thing you said when you had no idea what else to say. It was into this house, this beautiful, broken, obsessively tidy house, that Sophie Mercer arrived on the 12th of April, 1822, with 1 leather bag, 2 dresses, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned very early that the world is not especially interested in their opinions. She was 22 years old. She had come from a hiring agency in Swindon. Her references were impeccable, which is to say, they were the references of someone who has worked very hard and been noticed for it by no one in particular. She was engaged as a 3rd housemaid, which meant she was below the 2nd housemaid, and the 1st housemaid and the housekeeper, Mrs. Pratt, and very nearly below the tweenie. Except that the tweenie at Ashvale Park was 12 years old and terrified of her own shadow, which placed Sophie, by some unspoken arithmetic of household ranking, precisely in the middle of nowhere. No one told Sophie about the twins when she was hired. This was deliberate. Mrs. Pratt, who had survived the last 3 nurses and had a gift for institutional self-preservation, had discovered that mentioning the children during interviews caused candidates to withdraw their applications before they even crossed the threshold. Better to let them arrive, get settled, and then discover that the East Wing was a nightly ordeal. By the time they understood what they had walked into, they had already unpacked. Sophie unpacked on the afternoon of her arrival. She made her small corner of the servants' quarters neat with the efficiency of someone for whom neatness was not an aesthetic preference, but a form of armour. She ironed her 2nd dress with the iron the other maids had already abandoned as too heavy, because she was accustomed to things the other maids had abandoned. She ate dinner in the kitchen quietly, answered questions about herself briefly, and asked none in return. The other servants noted that she was not unfriendly, simply quiet, inward, like a book closed. She did not know, yet, what the East Wing held. She would find out that same night, at 1:30 in the morning, when the crying began. Tristan did not sleep. He had not slept, truly slept, the kind that goes deep and comes back slow, in longer than he could accurately calculate. He dozed in his study chair sometimes, waking with the candlestick burned down and a crick in his neck, and the particular bitterness that comes from having, once again, missed the night. He lay in his enormous ducal bed and stared at the canopy above him and thought about Eleanor's accounts, which he had been reorganizing because they needed reorganizing, because everything at Ashvale Park needed reorganizing, perpetually, always, because reorganization was the one activity that kept a man's mind from settling into its own darkness. He heard the twins start at 1:30, as he always did. He heard them through 2 closed doors and a long corridor, because fathers who do not sleep develop a terrible acuity of hearing, especially for the sounds of their children's suffering. He lay still for a moment, the same moment he lay still every night, calculating, as he always did, the precise quantity of hope he was willing to permit himself before getting up. The hope was that someone else would manage it, that the new maid— he had been vaguely aware of a new maid arriving, Mrs. Pratt had mentioned it, or one of the other servants would reach the children before he did. That tonight would be different, that whatever it was that seized his children in the dark hours would, on this particular night, decide not to come. It never decided not to come. He got up. He put on his dressing gown, dark wool, no embroidery, a practical garment, not a vain one. And he went into the corridor, and he walked toward the east wing, and he was 12 steps away from his children's room when he heard something that stopped him as completely as if someone had placed a hand flat against his chest. Silence. Not the silence of exhaustion, not the silence of children who had cried themselves insensible. A different silence, the silence of something answered. The silence of quiet, chosen rather than surrendered to. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, one hand braced against the wallpaper. Pale blue, small white flowers. Eleanor had chosen it. And he listened, and through the door, barely audible, he heard it. A woman's voice, low and unhurried, singing something he could not at first identify. A melody without particular ornamentation. A simple thing. The kind of tune that seemed to have always existed, that you could not imagine anyone having composed, that felt instead as though it had simply accumulated over generations, worn smooth by use. He knew it. He knew it the way you know the smell of a room you have not entered in 2 years, the way you know a handwriting that no longer writes to you. His body knew it before his mind did. His mind still working at the melody like a lock, turning it over, trying different keys. And by the time his mind caught up with what his body already understood, he was standing with his back flat against the corridor wall, both hands now pressed to the wallpaper, not moving. Eleanor used to sing it, not often, not in public. It was not a fashionable song, not the kind of drawing room air that young ladies practiced on the pianoforte and performed for their families on winter evenings. It was older than that. It was something Eleanor had known from childhood, from her own nurse. She had once told him, in one of those conversations married people have in the dark when they are tired enough to say true things. A Wiltshire tune, local, unremarkable, except that it had been hers, and now it was coming through the door of his children's room. Sung by a woman he did not know, and his children, who had not been silenced by anything at all, in 2 years, were quiet. Sophie had woken at the first sound of crying. She was a light sleeper, always had been. Another habit forged early, in circumstances she did not discuss. The crying had come through the thin wall between her small room and the corridor as clearly as if someone had spoken her name. She had lain still for a moment, exactly as Tristan had lain still, though from an entirely different position in the social architecture of the house, listening for the sounds of someone else responding. She had heard footsteps, hurried ones, somewhere in the direction of the east wing. She had thought, good. Someone else has it. Then she had heard those footsteps return, slower, and a door open and close, and the crying continue, unabated. She had not been asked to attend the children. She was a housemaid. The children were not her domain, not her responsibility, not in any formal sense, her concern. She had been in the house for 6 hours. She had met no one above the rank of footman and had not yet been introduced to Mrs. Pratt, except briefly, in passing, as one introduces a new piece of furniture. And yet she got up. She could not have explained it precisely. There was something in the sound of those two voices, because yes, she had already understood that there were two of them, that the crying was doubled, a twin architecture of distress, that she could not leave unanswered. Not from obligation, from something older than obligation and less rational. She put on her plain grey dress and her cap and went to the east wing. The room she found was a generous one, well appointed, as all rooms at Ashvale Park were well appointed, with 2 small beds side by side and a fireplace with its coals still orange and a shelf of toys that appeared to have been arranged by an adult and never touched by children. The nursery maid, a young woman named Dorcas, who had been in post for 3 weeks and was beginning to count the days, was standing in the centre of the room, looking both helpless and resentful, which is the precise expression of a person who has tried everything they can think of and arrived at the conclusion that the problem is the children's fault. A second servant, a footman who had been pressed into service and was deeply uncomfortable about it, stood near the door. On the beds, Oliver and Iris de Leon were upright, red-faced, tear-wet, and making a noise that, and Sophie would think about this later, when the night was over and she had time to think, sounded less like distress and more like searching, as though they were calling for something, as though they expected, on some cellular and inarticulate level, an answer. No one in the room was answering them. No one knew what question was being asked. Sophie came in without being invited. Dorcas turned to look at her with an expression that began as irritation and shifted, within seconds, to a desperate kind of relief. The footman stepped aside. Sophie crossed to the space between the two small beds, sat down on the floor, not on a chair, not standing, on the floor, between them, and did not speak, and did not reach for either child. She simply sat, as though she had been there a long time already, as though the room were hers. The twins looked at her, looked at this small, still woman on the floor of their room in her grey dress and her white cap, who had not tried to pick them up, or shush them, or offer warm milk, or make the face that adults made. The specific, distressing face of adult helplessness performed as reassurance, and something shifted. They didn't stop crying immediately. Children's emotions don't resolve like that, as though a switch had been thrown, but the texture changed. The searching quality, the calling into the dark quality, reduced. They were still crying, but they were looking at her. And Sophie, after a long moment, began to hum. She could not have told you where the melody came from. It was there the way her own heartbeat was there, not chosen, simply present. An old tune, wordless at first, the kind of thing you don't know you know until your mouth opens and it's already there. She hummed it quietly, without performance, looking at the space between the two beds rather than at the children, not wanting them to feel the pressure of being watched. And the tune unreeled from her in the dark like a thread, and the twins followed it. By the second verse, still wordless, still soft, Oliver had stopped crying. He was sitting with his knees pulled to his chest, watching her with an expression of concentrated attention that looked absurdly like an adult's expression of concentrated attention, and was therefore somewhat unsettling on a face as round and unformed as his. By the third verse, Iris had leaned sideways until her head found Sophie's shoulder, which she could reach from the bed with only a slight stretch, and had stayed there. By the fourth, both children were breathing slowly. Sophie let the melody run out and did not start it again. She stayed on the floor. Dorcas, in the corner, had gone very still. The footman had simply ceased to exist as a meaningful presence in the room. Then Sophie looked up and saw the Duke. He was in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. The door had been ajar. She had not heard it open further, but then she had not been listening for it. He was tall, which she registered first because it was difficult not to register, and he was in a dark dressing gown, and he was standing very still in the way that people stand when they have been caught doing something they did not intend to do, which in his case appeared to be feeling something. His face, which she would later learn had a reputation in the county for being handsome and in the household for being unreadable, was, at that specific moment, neither handsomely composed nor unreadably blank. It was open. It was stricken. It was the face of a man who had just heard, through the mouth of a stranger, something he thought he had lost forever. He recovered in less than 3 seconds. The face closed. The handsomeness reasserted itself. The unreadability returned like a curtain drawn. Sophie, for her part, did the thing she had learned to do when she found herself in rooms where she had not been invited. She became very still and very quiet and waited for instruction. None came. He looked at her for a moment, not warmly, exactly, but with an intensity that was its own kind of attention. And then he turned and went back down the corridor, and the door swung softly closed behind him. Dorcas and the footman exchanged a look. Sophie got up from the floor, straightened her dress, and told Dorcas she was welcome to go back to bed. Then she sat in the chair near the fireplace and kept watch until both children slept, which took another 20 minutes, in silence. She did not know what she had done. She did not know what the melody was, or where it had come from. She knew only that it had worked, and that the man in the doorway had known the tune, and that whatever the tune meant to him was none of her business, and probably best left that way. She was a third housemaid. He was a duke. That was the whole of the map. He summoned her the following morning. Not immediately. He ate his breakfast alone in the dining room. Eggs, toast, coffee, the newspaper unread beside his plate. And he spent an hour in his study going over correspondence that did not require his attention. And then another half-hour standing at the window watching the gardeners rake the gravel back and forth in the forecourt below, because the gardeners were raking it perfectly well without his observation, and the observation served no function except to give his body somewhere to be, while his mind went where it wanted to go. It went, against every instruction he gave it, back to the corridor, back to the doorway, back to the sight of his children, his two small, grieving, inconsolable children, asleep because of a song, because of a woman he did not know who had sat on the floor of their room as though she belonged there and hummed a melody that had no right to be in her possession. He summoned her at 10 o'clock, Mrs. Pratt. When told to send the new housemaid to the study, produced the particular expression that experienced housekeepers produce when the domestic order they have carefully constructed is threatened by an unexpected diagonal move on the part of their employer. She said, "Yes, Your Grace," and went to find Sophie and relayed the instruction with the addition, for Mrs. Pratt was a woman who had spent 40 years managing the interface between ducal authority and below-stairs dignity, of a brief, quiet, "Don't be alarmed, he is direct, but he is not unkind." Sophie did not know what to do with this. She had not been alarmed. She had been, if she was honest, and she was almost always honest with herself, because it cost too much not to be. Curious, she had thought about the man in the doorway more than was sensible, in the small hours after the twins slept and before her own sleep came. Not about him as a man, or not only that, about his face, about what had been on it, briefly, before he controlled it. About the question that raised, what did a man who had already lost so much still have to lose? She thought, too, about herself, about the thing she had never spoken of to any employer or agency or careful woman who had written her references and sent her on. About the fact that she had always carried music the way other people carried memories. Not as a chosen thing, but as something ambient, woven into her, older than conscious recall. Her mother, who had died of a fever when Sophie was 9, in the small stone cottage in Harton, near Frome, had been the same. Sophie remembered her standing at the kitchen window singing to no one in particular. Tunes without names. Tunes that seemed to rise from the walls of the house itself, rather than from any person. When her mother died and her father, a schoolmaster of modest means and immodest grief, found he could no longer maintain the cottage nor the child, Sophie had been placed with a distant cousin in Dorset at the age of 10. The cousin was not unkind, merely practical, and practical meant useful. Sophie had been useful ever since. What she had never been able to explain, to herself or anyone, was why the music stayed when everything else, the cottage, the kitchen window, the smell of her mother's hair, had grown faint with time. Why she could sit in a dark room with 2 grieving children and find, rising in her throat like something summoned, a melody she had no name for and no right to. She had stopped trying to explain it. Some inheritances did not come with documents. You simply carried them, the way you carried your eyes or your hands, and were quietly grateful they were there. She came to the study at 10:10, which is the precise amount of time it takes to walk from the servants' quarters to the East Corridor study, at a pace that communicates neither eagerness nor reluctance. She knocked. She was told to enter. She entered. The study was a large room lined with books that had actually been read. This was immediately apparent from the state of the spines, and furnished with the particular heaviness of furniture chosen by someone who needed things to be solid. A large desk, 2 dark leather chairs, a fireplace with a marble surround, portraits on the walls, family ones, spanning what appeared to be several generations of de Leon men who shared the same wide-set eyes and the same quality of holding themselves as though braced against something. Tristan was standing by the window. He did not sit when she entered, which was either a lack of consideration or a statement of discomfort, and Sophie was experienced enough to know it was probably the latter. He was wearing, in the morning light, the full architecture of a duke: dark coat, white cravat, the whole formal edifice. He looked considerably more composed than he had in the corridor. He had had hours to rebuild, and he had used them. He looked at her for a moment, the same brief but total attention he had given her in the doorway. And then he said, without preamble, "Where did you learn that song?" He did not phrase it as a question. It came out flat and direct and slightly too fast, like something released from pressure. Sophie heard all 3 of those qualities and catalogued them before she answered. She told him, honestly, that she did not know, that she had not been aware she knew it until she sang it, that it was the kind of tune that seems to have no origin, that had simply been inside her as long as she could remember. He received this in silence. It was not a comfortable silence. It pressed, and Sophie, who had sat with many uncomfortable silences in her 22 years, waited it out without fidgeting. He asked her where she was from. She told him, Somerset, originally, a village called Harton, near Frome. He received this too, without expression, though she saw something pass behind his eyes that she could not read. He asked how long she had been in service. She said 6 years. He asked where she had been before Ashvale. She told him, a family in Bath, and before that, a family in Dorset. He asked their names. She gave them. He wrote nothing down, but she had the sense that everything was being recorded somewhere, filed in the efficient, capacious way that practical men file things they intend to examine later. Then he was quiet for a long moment. And Sophie waited, and the fire crackled, and outside the window the gravel was being raked for the 2nd time that morning. He said, with the specific care of someone choosing words not for their beauty, but for their precision, the children respond to no one. They have not responded to anyone since their mother died. Whatever you did last night, I cannot account for it, and I will not pretend to. But I need you to understand that my children are not a curiosity, and they are not an experiment, and if you cannot be consistent, you should say so now. Sophie looked at him. She thought about 6 words and then said them. I am always consistent, Your Grace. It was not defiance. It was quieter than defiance. It was the particular statement of a person who has made reliability the one currency they can afford, and who has spent it carefully. He heard that. She could tell from the slight shift of his weight, the change in the angle of his chin, that he had heard exactly what she meant and had decided, provisionally, that she might mean it. He said, You will continue with your regular duties. And he said, If the children are distressed at night and the on-duty staff cannot manage, you will be called for. And he said, This is not a promotion. It is a task. And Sophie, who understood perfectly well what he was and was not saying, and was experienced enough to know when a man was covering practical need with formal distance, said yes, Your Grace, and waited to be dismissed. He dismissed her. She went. He stood by the window for a long time after she left. The gardens below were immaculate. The gravel was raked. Everything was exactly as it should be, which meant nothing at all, which was the precise problem. He was 35 years old, and he had been managing Ashvale Park for 6 years as the Duke, and for 4 years before that as the heir apparent, learning the role from his father. And in all those 10 years of management, he had never had occasion to feel that a room was different after someone left it. Rooms were rooms. They did not carry the residue of people, except that this one did. The particular quality of stillness that she carried with her had settled briefly into the room and was only now dissipating, and he was aware of its dissipation as a loss, which was an absurd thing to think about a housemaid he had spoken to for 10 minutes, and he was aware that it was absurd, and he thought it anyway. He went to his desk and did not open the correspondence. He sat for a while. Then he took out a sheet of paper and wrote a brief letter to his solicitor about a land matter he had already settled, because he needed something to do with his hands. The letter was terrible. He wrote it twice. The weeks that followed had the quality of a truce in wartime, an agreed suspension of hostilities that allows both sides to rest, knowing full well that the underlying causes have not been resolved. Sophie settled into the rhythms of Ashvale Park with the thoroughness and efficiency that had characterized every position she had held. She was good at her work, genuinely good, not merely competent, in the way that people who have made their craft their only reliable possession are good. Floors gleamed. Fires were laid before anyone noticed they were needed. Linens were pressed with a precision that Mrs. Pratt, who had been managing households for 4 decades, found privately impressive and publicly unremarked upon, because to remark upon a housemaid's work was to acknowledge that you had been watching it, and there was something about Sophie Mercer that made people uncertain whether they were permitted to watch her. This was the peculiar thing. She was impossible to overlook, and yet continually overlooked. The other servants noticed her work without quite noticing her. The upper servants included her in the routines of the house without including her in the routines of the servants' hall, not from hostility, but from some instinct that she did not require including, that she was self-sufficient in a way that made community optional. The footmen were politely indifferent. Dorcas, the nursery maid, had developed a tentative gratitude toward her that expressed itself in small offerings. The better chair near the fire, the last of the good tea, which Sophie accepted with equal smallness. She was called to the East Wing 3 more times in the first 2 weeks. Each time, the same ritual, the night crying, the failed attempts of on-duty staff, the quiet knock at Sophie's door, the walk down the corridor, the floor between the 2 beds, the song, and each time, the same result: quiet, sleep, the mystery that no one could explain. The 4th time, Tristan was not in the corridor. She noticed his absence the way you notice the absence of something that has been there before, some background element your senses had been tracking without your conscious knowledge. She was not sure if she was relieved or not. She decided not to investigate this question. He was there the 5th time, not in the doorway as before, or not initially. Sophie became aware of him while she was still sitting on the floor, still humming, a minute into the ritual, when the weight of being observed from a different angle registered. She glanced sideways and saw him through the half-open door, in the corridor, standing in the dark, and she had the odd impression that he had not chosen to be there, that he had been walking somewhere else and found himself stopped. She did not look at him for long. She looked back at the children, who were settling, and kept humming, and after a few minutes she heard his footsteps retreat quietly down the corridor and did not hear them stop again. She thought about this, later. She thought about what it meant that a man who had removed himself from his children's suffering for 2 years, who had found 100 practical and structural reasons not to enter that room, was standing outside the door in the dark, listening. She thought about the stone she had felt in him in those 10 careful minutes in the study, the stone that people grow around guilt, smooth and dense, harder than ordinary grief. She thought about how you could not move a stone like that from outside. You could only wait for the person carrying it to put it down. She did not think she could help with that. That was not her work. She was a housemaid. He was a duke. The map was clear, but she thought about it. It was the children who changed things, as children will. It was a Wednesday in late May, 6 weeks after Sophie's arrival, and it was raining. The specific Wiltshire rain that is more atmosphere than precipitation. A dampness that comes from everywhere at once, the kind that settles into gardens and hair and the corners of rooms. The house was indoors. Everyone was indoors. The great advantage of a large house in rain is that there is room enough to be enclosed in it without quite touching. Sophie was in the east corridor, polishing the hall table that stood below a painting of the fourth Duke, an uninspiring work of the subject in hunting clothes, looking as though he had been posed while thinking about something else, when she became aware, gradually, of being watched. She looked down the corridor, and there they were, Oliver and Iris de Lyon, 4 years old, in their small indoor clothes, standing at the end of the corridor and looking at her with the full, unself-conscious attention of children who have not yet learned that staring is rude. Dorcas was not with them, which meant they had come on their own, which was, Sophie understood this without needing to have it explained, not a thing they had ever done before. She stayed still. She did not put down the cloth, did not make any of the sudden movements that startle children who are on the edge of a decision. She waited. The children looked at her. She looked back. It was Oliver who moved first. Of course it was Oliver. She had already learned in 5 visits that Oliver was the one who moved first, and Iris was the one who decided if it was safe, walking down the corridor toward her with the slightly over-deliberate gait of a small person navigating a long distance on short legs. He stopped about 4 feet away from her and said, with the bluntness of the very young, "You sing." Sophie said, "Sometimes." He considered this. Then he said, "Will you sing now?" She said, "If you like." He nodded. Then he sat down on the floor of the corridor, right there, on the polished floorboards, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a child for whom the floor is simply the nearest available seating. Iris, after a moment's assessment, came down the corridor and sat beside him. Sophie looked at them for a moment. Then she put down her cloth, sat on the floor across from them, back against the wall, legs crossed, which put her at approximately child height, and she began. She sang them 3 songs, none of which she could have traced to a source. They were simply there, as they always were, pulled up from wherever inside her they lived, unhurried and unornamented. Oliver sat through all 3 with the look of a small judge evaluating a presentation. Iris, after the first one, shifted over and leaned against Sophie's arm, which was where she stayed for the rest. They did not ask what the songs were. They did not ask where she had learned them. They asked only, when the 3rd song was done, if she would come back tomorrow. She said yes. That was all. They got up and went back to their room, apparently satisfied. Sophie picked up her cloth and finished the hall table and went back to her work. And the corridor was as it had been, and the 4th Duke in his hunting clothes looked down at nothing in particular, as he had always done. She did not know that Tristan had been behind the door of his study, which opened onto that corridor, and had heard every note. He had not meant to listen. He had been at his desk, actually working this time, a lease renewal for one of the tenant farms that required his genuine attention, when he had heard Oliver's voice in the corridor and had gone still. Because Oliver's voice in the corridor at that hour meant one of 2 things, that something was wrong or that something unprecedented was happening. He had listened and understood within 30 seconds that it was the latter, and had stayed at his desk rather than open the door because opening the door would have interrupted whatever was occurring, and also, if he was honest, because he was not sure he could open the door without being heard. And he did not want to be heard. He sat and listened to his children sit in a corridor and ask a woman to sing to them. He sat and listened to the songs come, low, steady, patient, unhurried. And he sat and listened to his daughter make the small sound she made when she was comfortable, the unconscious hum that had always meant she was not afraid, a sound he had not heard in 2 years. He sat there after they left, and after Sophie had returned to her work, and after the corridor was quiet again. And he sat there for a long time, and he thought about the shape of things. He thought about Eleanor, who had lived in this house, and who had loved it, and who had known the names of all the tenant farmers, children, and who had picked that wallpaper in the East Wing corridor, the pale blue with the white flowers, because she said it was cheerful without trying too hard, and who had died while he was in London managing things that did not actually need managing. He thought about the guilt that he had placed in his chest and maintained there like a kept fire, feeding it with absence, with work, with the obsessive management of gravel and lease renewals and correspondence. He thought about whether guilt was the thing Eleanor would have wanted him to carry, and arrived, as he always arrived when this thought came, at the answer he always avoided. She would not have wanted that. She had been a person of extraordinary practical mercy. She would not have wanted it at all. But knowing something is not carried in wanting. It is carried in the doing, and he had not been able to do it, until now, perhaps, some small part of him thought, until now, some small part of him amended. He found her the following morning in the kitchen garden. She was cutting herbs for Mrs. Higgs, the cook, which was not technically a housemaid's task, but which Sophie had evidently volunteered for on the grounds that she happened to be walking past the garden, and Mrs. Higgs happened to need them. She had a basket and a small knife, and was moving through the rosemary with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. And she did not hear him come through the gate because the rain of the previous day had softened everything underfoot. He said her name, Miss Mercer, and she turned, and the look she gave him in that first unguarded second was readable. Not afraid, not flustered, but aware. Aware of him in the way that he had, he realized, become aware of her, as a specific presence, not a category. He said that he wished to speak with her, and she set down the basket with the same economy of movement she always had and waited. He had prepared something to say. He had composed it at his desk the previous evening, amended it before bed, revised it again that morning. It was a practical, measured statement about the children's welfare and the arrangement of additional duties and the matter of remuneration for same. It was entirely adequate. He did not say it. What he said instead, standing in the kitchen garden with the wet herbs around them and the morning light coming in grey and cool from the east, was, I heard them yesterday. In the corridor, I heard what they asked you, and what you did. Sophie looked at him. She said nothing. He said, I don't know how to thank you. And then, because he was a man who had spent 2 years not saying true things, and was now discovering that the architecture of not saying them was more expensive to maintain than he had understood. I don't know how to thank you because I don't have the right words for what you've given them, or for what you've given me, hearing it. It was the most he had said to anyone about Eleanor since the funeral. Sophie stood with her basket at her feet and looked at him, and he looked at her, and the morning was quiet around them, and then she said, I'm glad they're sleeping. Your Grace. It was a small thing to say. It was perhaps not equal to the weight of what he had said, but it was, he understood immediately, exactly right. Not because it was profound, but because it was true, and because she had chosen the true thing over the significant sounding thing. And he had spent enough time around people who chose the significant sounding thing to know the difference. He said, I wanted to tell you, and I should have told you earlier, when I spoke with you in the study, that what happened with my wife, with her illness, was something I managed very poorly. And because I managed it poorly, my children carry things they should not have to carry. And I cannot undo that. But I can. I want to try to be more present than I have been. Sophie looked at him carefully. Then she said, They would like that. They talk about you, you know. He looked as though he had been quietly struck. He said, Do they? She said, Oliver asked me last night what you do all day. I told him you manage the estate. He said he knows that. He wants to know what you do when you're not managing it. I didn't know what to tell him. Tristan was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A short sound, not practiced, not social, the involuntary kind. He said, That is a very good question. Sophie picked up her basket. She said, I should get these to Mrs. Higgs. And then, as she passed him toward the gate, she said, quietly, not quite to him and not quite to the garden, Perhaps you could answer it for them yourself. He stood in the kitchen garden for a while after she was gone. The herbs were wet and fragrant around him. The morning light was getting warmer. Somewhere in the east wing, he could hear, or thought he could hear, or wished he could hear, the sound of his children beginning their day. He went in. The first time Tristan went to the children's room during the day, not in response to a crisis, not in the middle of the night, not on any occasion that required his presence. Oliver stared at him for a full 10 seconds before saying, with characteristic directness, "You came." Tristan sat on the edge of the small chair that was too small for him, because it was the only chair in the room, and said, "I came." Iris, who had been pretending to be absorbed in a wooden horse, looked up from the corner. She did not come over, but she looked. Oliver said, "Sophie says you manage things." Tristan said, "I do." Oliver said, "What kinds of things?" And Tristan, who had delivered reports to Parliament and negotiated leases and managed a ducal estate of 12,000 acres, sat on a too small chair in his children's room and told his 4-year-old son about tenant farming in terms of a story involving sheep, and Oliver listened with the attention of a small judge. And Iris, in the corner, had moved slightly closer without appearing to have done so deliberately. He stayed for 40 minutes. He came back the next day, and the day after that. The stone in his chest did not disappear. He had not expected it to, but it had, he noticed, shifted. Moved from the center of him towards some less obstructing position, enough that he could breathe around it, enough that breathing did not feel so much like labor. It was in the 3rd week of June, 2 months after Sophie's arrival, on a warm evening when the gardens were finally earning their keep and the light lasted until nearly 9, that the thing that had been gathered. She was in the library. This was, strictly speaking, not a place a third housemaid went without instruction. The library at Ashvale Park was a serious room, 2 stories of books behind a gallery railing, a rolling ladder, 3 large reading tables, and the particular reverent silence of a room that had always been treated as important. Housemaids cleaned it on Tuesday mornings under the supervision of Mrs. Pratt, and otherwise left it to those it belonged to. But it was evening, and the family had been at table, and Sophie had been sent to check whether the fire had been banked, and she had banked the fire, and then she had looked at the shelves. Just looked. The way people look at things they love and cannot afford, and have trained themselves to love only from a distance. She had her hand on the spine of a volume, Natural History, she thought, pressed leather, the title worn almost to illegibility. When she heard him come in, she stepped back immediately. She said, "I was just checking the fire. Your Grace, it's banked." He looked at the book, and then at her, and said, "What were you looking at?" She said, "Natural History, I think." I couldn't quite read the title. He crossed to the shelf. He looked at the spine. He said, "Pennant's British Zoology, 1768, my father's copy." He used to read the bird sections aloud at breakfast, which was, he paused, either charming or maddening, depending on the morning. Sophie said, "It sounds charming." He looked at her. Then he took the volume off the shelf and held it out. She looked at it, then at him. She said, "Carefully, I shouldn't." He said, "You can read." It was not a question. He had known since the study. There were things you could not conceal from someone paying the kind of attention he had been paying. And she had known he knew. She said, "Yes." He said, "Then take it. Bring it back when you're finished." He paused, then said, "You can use the East reading table in the evenings. If it's unoccupied, it generally is." Sophie took the book. She held it the way you hold something you have been wanting without permitting yourself to want it, with both hands, at the exact center of the spine, with a care that was both practical and entirely impractical. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace." He said, "Stop thanking me for things that cost nothing." She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression that was not the closed, careful expression she had grown accustomed to reading. It was something else, something from the same part of him that had appeared briefly in the doorway that first night, and had been appearing with increasing frequency in the weeks since, in small moments, a word in passing, an exchange in the corridor, the time she had looked up from the floor between his children's beds, and found him standing not in the doorway, but in the room itself, sitting quietly on the edge of Iris's bed, rather than watching from outside. She said, "I know nothing costs nothing. Everything costs something," he said quietly. "That's true." There was a long moment then, with the fire low and the evening light coming through the tall library windows at the horizontal angle of a June evening, and the book in her hands, and the particular quality of a silence that is not empty but full. Full of things neither of them said, full of the shape of things that cannot be said, not yet, not between a duke and a housemaid in England in 1822, where the rules about what can be said and between whom have the force of walls. He said, "My children tell me you have been teaching Oliver to read." She said, "He asked." "I hope that was not presumptuous." He said, "It was exactly right. Everything you do with them is exactly right." She did not know what to do with this. She was not accustomed to praise from people above her. She had worked hard for 6 years in rooms where her work was noted and not mentioned, and the absence of complaint was the compliment, and that had been fine. She was accustomed to fine. But this was not fine. This was something else, warm and direct and offered without the social cushioning that made compliments safe by making them impersonal. She said, "They are not difficult. People say they are difficult. I think they are not difficult. They are simply, they have been trying to reach something and not finding it. That is not difficulty. That is just grief, expressed the only way a 4-year-old knows how." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Is that what it is?" She said, gently, "I think so." He said, after another pause, "And what about when you can't find what you're reaching for?" She looked at him. She thought about this. She said, "I think sometimes what you're reaching for isn't a thing. It's a person. And if that person isn't there," she paused, "you find someone who's willing to sit with you in the dark. And that's not the same. But it helps." He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, the last of the evening was going gold. He said, "You sat with them in the dark." She said, "I sat on the floor." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the preliminary motion of one bee, the shape of something that had forgotten its name. He said, "Miss Mercer," and then he stopped. He tried again, "Sophie," and then he stopped again, because there are things you cannot say in a library in June in 1822, things the walls themselves will not permit. And he knew this, and she knew this, and knowing it was its own kind of ache, he said, "I don't know what to do with any of this." She said, "I know," and she did not say anything else, because sometimes the most complete answer is the simplest one. 3 days after the library, Tristan called for Mrs. Pratt and told her that Miss Sophie Mercer was to be elevated from third housemaid to children's companion, with the duties, wages, and standing appropriate to that position. Mrs. Pratt, who had been waiting for something like this, received the instruction without visible surprise, said "Yes, Your Grace," and went to make the arrangements. Sophie received this news sitting in the kitchen with Dorcas, who told her with the specific mix of excitement and second-hand jealousy that good people feel when good things happen to people they like. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's very generous of him," Dorcas said. "It's not generosity, it's common sense. Anyone can see that you..." And then stopped herself, because the rest of the sentence was the kind of thing that turned from observation into something else. And Dorcas was a sensible girl who did not want to be wrong. Sophie smiled at her, small and careful. She said, "How are the Herbs doing this week?" And they talked about herbs. The evening of the 23rd of June, 1822, was the kind of evening that looks, in retrospect, like it was arranged. The children were asleep. They were sleeping better now, had been sleeping better for 3 weeks, waking occasionally, but settling quickly. The nightmares becoming less frequent by degrees that Sophie could track in the quality of their breathing. Tristan had been in the study. Sophie had been in the library. She had her own hour in the library now, most evenings after supper. The East reading table, Pennant's British Zoology, long since finished, and replaced with a botany text, and then with a history of the English countryside that she found deeply absorbing. He found her there at 8:30, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he sat down across from her at the reading table, which he had never done before, and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "I've been writing to Eleanor's family, her mother. I haven't written since the funeral." Sophie looked up from her book. He said, "I didn't know what to say to them. I still don't know, entirely. But I thought..." He paused. "I thought the children should know her family. They should know where she came from. They should know the stories about her that I don't know, because I was absent when they were being made." Sophie said, "That is a brave thing to do." He said, "It is a 2-year late thing to do." She said, "The same thing, sometimes." He looked at her across the reading table, in the lamplight, and she looked back at him. And it was there between them, plain as the books on the shelves, the impossible, inconvenient, entirely real thing that had been growing since that first night in the doorway. Growing the way difficult things grow, not despite the obstacles, but somehow because of them. Because the walls between them had forced everything to become meaningful that might otherwise have been casual, and nothing between them had ever been casual. He said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "You probably shouldn't." He said, "I know." She said, "There are rules about this." He said, "I know all the rules." She said, quietly, "Knowing them and following them are different things." He said, "I know that too." She looked at her book. She looked at her hands on the book. She said, "I am not in a position to," and then stopped, because this was also true and also insufficient, because positions are structures, and structures can be changed. But she did not know if this one could be changed without collapsing everything else, and she had spent 6 years building reliability as her one portable asset, and she was afraid, in a way she could not quite look at directly, of what it meant to want something she had no right to want. He said, "I am not asking you for anything." She said, "I know." He said, "I am only telling you that since you came to this house, something has shifted. Not because you are," he stopped again, "not because of any single thing, because you are exactly who you are. And I am not sure I have ever said that to anyone." She sat with this. It was a heavy thing to sit with. It had the weight of a true thing. She said, "Your children need you to be well. That is the most important thing. Whatever else," she paused, "whatever else is real, or might be real, your children need you present and whole, and you are becoming that. Don't lose that for something uncertain." He said, "Are you telling me to be careful?" She said, "I'm telling you that I'm not going anywhere." And she looked at him very directly when she said it, which was unusual for her and deliberate. "I am not going anywhere, Your Grace. That is what I can tell you tonight. The rest can wait until the rest is possible." He held her gaze, then he nodded. Once, with the contained precision of a man who has been given something he needed and is not sure how to carry it yet. He said, "Good night, Miss Mercer." She said, "Good night, Your Grace." He left. She sat for a while in the lamplight with Pennant's book in her hands, though she was not reading it. Then she banked the library fire and went to her room and lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, which was ordinary and low and nothing like the canopy of a ducal bed, and was exactly where she was, and was enough. She was there the next morning when Oliver came to find her at breakfast, trailing Iris in the habitual 2-step delay that was their pattern. He sat down next to her at the servants' table, which was, technically, not a place where children sat, but which Mrs. Higgs had the practical wisdom not to address, and said, without preamble, "Papa came in to say good night." Sophie looked at him. She said, "He did." Oliver said, "Yes." He read from the sheet book. Then he sat there for a while. He didn't say anything, but he stayed. Iris, sitting on Sophie's other side, slid her hand into Sophie's without comment, which was Iris's way. Sophie said, "How was that, having him stay?" Oliver considered this with the seriousness he brought to all evaluative questions. He said, "It was good. It felt like—" He searched for the word and found one that was too large for his mouth and said it anyway. "It felt like before." Sophie did not trust herself to speak for a moment. She squeezed Iris's hand and said, "Good. That's good." Oliver, satisfied, reached across the table for a bread roll, which ended the philosophical portion of the breakfast. Iris stayed leaning against Sophie's arm until Mrs. Higgs called everyone to attention, and the morning began its ordinary business of being a morning. Autumn came to Wiltshire the way it always did, gradually and then all at once. The trees at Ashvale Park went from green to gold with a speed that always surprised, as though the estate had been waiting, coiled, for the permission of September. The harvests were brought in. The tenant leases were reviewed. The gravel was raked against falling leaves with an ongoing futility that the gardeners had accepted as their particular lot in life. Tristan wrote to Eleanor's mother in Strathmere. The reply came after 3 weeks, careful, cautious. The letter of a woman who had also been carrying something and was not sure she was safe to put it down. He wrote back. They found, in the exchange, that they were both circling the same grief from different angles, and that the circling, done together at this distance, was less isolating than the circling done alone. In December, he would take the children north to visit their grandmother for the first time. This was still months away, but it was decided. It was in one of those letters, the 4th or 5th, by now arriving with a regularity that had become quietly sustaining, that Eleanor's mother mentioned the song. She had asked, in her careful way, whether the children were sleeping better. Tristan had written back that they were, and had described, with the brevity of a man still learning how to say true things in writing, the circumstances, a young woman on the staff, a melody she sang without knowing its source, the inexplicable quiet that followed. He had not expected this to mean anything to Lady Strathmere. He had written it because it was true. Her reply arrived on a Wednesday morning. He read it at his desk. He read it twice. She wrote that the melody Tristan described, a tune without proper words, a Wiltshire thing, old and worn smooth by use, had been in Eleanor's family for at least 3 generations. Eleanor's own nurse, a woman called Martha Birch, who had served the Graves household from 1788 until her retirement in 1811, had sung it to every child in the nursery at Strathmere House. Eleanor had known it from infancy, and Martha Birch, Lady Strathmere wrote, had been a woman of Somerset origin, from a village called Harton near Frome, who had come into service with the Graves family as a girl of 14 and had brought the song with her from home. Tristan sat with this for a long time. Then he went to find Sophie. He told her what the letter said. He told her about Martha Birch, the nurse from Harton. He watched Sophie's face while he spoke, the particular stillness of it, and then something shifting under the stillness, something opening. She said, quietly, "My grandmother's name was Birch." They looked at each other across the kitchen garden, in the September light, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because some things do not require speech. Some things only require the space to be true in. The song had travelled from a woman in Somerset to her granddaughter, to a nursery in Wiltshire, to a young duchess, to 2 small children who could not sleep, and had found, in the end, the one person who still carried it. It had found its way home, or it had made a new one. Perhaps, Sophie thought, those were the same thing. Oliver learned the alphabet, all of it. He had a system for remembering the letters that Sophie had not taught him and could not have invented, which involved assigning each letter a personality. G, for instance, was apparently a dependable fellow. while X was untrustworthy and best avoided, and which seemed to be working, since he could now identify letters in books and spent considerable time reading labels on jars in the pantry and announcing their contents to anyone who would listen. Iris, characteristically, learned the whole alphabet in one afternoon by watching Oliver and did not tell anyone until she was ready. This was the most Iris thing she had ever done, and when Sophie discovered it, Iris silently reading a full sentence from the history text Sophie had left on the reading table. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment and composed herself. The nightmares became rare. By October, they had stopped entirely. The house slept. On an October evening, with the leaves piling against the garden wall and the fire lit in the library for the first time that autumn, Tristan sat across from Sophie at the reading table as he did most evenings now, and neither of them was reading. He said, "I have been speaking with my solicitor." She looked up. He said, "About certain arrangements. That would require..." He stopped, started again. "That would not be conventional, and would require the cooperation of several people who I trust, and one person whose cooperation I value more than any of the others." She said, "That sounds like the beginning of a conversation that is not about tenant leases." He said, quietly, "It is not about tenant leases." She said, "You told me once that the rest could wait until it was possible." He said, "I am asking if it is possible." She thought about the map, the clear, explicit map she had drawn for herself, with its clear, explicit distances and territories. She thought about 6 years of careful work and careful wanting, and the walls that were walls, and the rules that were rules. And she thought about Oliver reading jar labels in the pantry, and Iris's hand in hers at breakfast, and the man across the table who had learned, in 5 months, to stop managing the gravel and stay in the room. She said, "The rules say it isn't possible." He said, "I know." She said, "What does your solicitor say?" And he told her. He told her about what could be done, what had been done, what arrangements were already in motion, the quiet work of changing what could be changed for a man with his resources and his patience, the things that could not be changed and would require courage instead of resources, the things that would be difficult and the things that would be less difficult than people expected, and the things that the ton would say and what both of them would say back. She listened. She asked one question and then another, not the questions of someone being persuaded, but the questions of someone taking a thing apart to see how it was made. He finished. He waited. She said, after a long moment, "I am still not going anywhere." He said, "I know. I am asking if you would consider going somewhere. Specifically, if you would consider being here." She looked at him differently. Sophie Mercer, daughter of nobody in particular, third housemaid, keeper of songs, woman who sat on floors in the dark, looked at Tristan Edward Cavendish de Lyon, 6th Duke of Lyon, who had stood in a corridor for months being undone by a tune, and she said, "Yes, just that, one syllable," which contained, as one syllable sometimes does, everything. It was not immediate. It was not simple. None of the things that followed were simple, because nothing real and good is simple, and because England in 1822 was England in 1822, and walls are walls even when they are coming down. There were conversations with solicitors and clergymen, and one extremely sceptical but ultimately cooperative aunt. There were people in London who said things that were unkind, and some who said things that were merely curious, and a very few who said nothing at all, because they could see, clearly enough, that whatever this was, it was the kind that held. Tristan's mother, the Dowager Duchess, came to Ashvale Park in November and spent 4 days in a state of contained alarm that gradually resolved after 2 meals with Sophie, 1 long walk in the kitchen garden, and a morning watching Sophie read to the children, into something she described to her closest friend as entirely irregular and entirely right. And if you repeat that, I will deny it categorically. Oliver was informed, in terms appropriate to his age, which meant Papa and Sophie will be together now, in the way that some people are together, and Sophie will stay. He received this with his characteristic judicial gravity, thought for a moment, and said, I knew. Iris said nothing, but she was smiling, and her smile, when it came, was Eleanor's. She had Eleanor's exact smile, precise and private, the smile of someone who has understood something a little ahead of everyone else. Sophie stood in the kitchen garden on the morning of her wedding. A November morning, grey and cold and honest, the way she preferred her mornings. And she held a small bunch of rosemary, because rosemary was what the kitchen garden had. And rosemary was, it turned out, exactly sufficient. She thought about the song she had sung, the first night, without knowing. She thought about where it had come from, and whether she would ever know. She had stopped asking. Some things were not explanations. Some things were simply given. Tristan came to find her in the garden. It was where he always came to find her, because this was where she was. And he said, You are cold. She said, I'm always cold. He said, I know. He put his coat around her, which he had done before, on other cold mornings, because the practical expression of care is one of the things he had learned in the months since April, the way you can learn things when you stop managing them and simply do them. She said, Are you ready? He said, I have been ready since the corridor. She looked at him. She said, Which corridor? He said, You know which corridor. She did. They went inside. The house in the winter light was Ashvale Park, as it had always been. The gravel raked, the hedgerows cut, the footmen's uniforms pressed. But the east wing was different now, in the way that rooms are different when the grief in them has not disappeared, but has been joined by something else, some opposing force that does not cancel the sorrow, but keeps it company, makes it bearable, makes it part of a larger story instead of the whole story. In December of 1822, 3 weeks after the wedding, the ground still hard with the first frost of the season, Tristan took his family north to Strathmere, his family. He was still getting accustomed to using that word with its full weight. Oliver and Iris, bundled into the travelling coach with more blankets than were strictly necessary, sat on either side of Sophie for the better part of the journey and took turns asking questions that had no satisfactory answers, which was their preferred form of entertainment. Tristan sat across from them and watched and said very little, and felt, for the first time in years, that silence was restful rather than punishing. Lady Strathmere received them in the drawing-room of Strathmere House, which was a severe and beautiful room that smelled of old wood and winter flowers. She was 61 years old, and had Eleanor's eyes and Eleanor's way of going still when she was deciding something. She looked at Sophie for a long moment, at the plain dress, the quiet hands, the particular quality of attention Sophie brought to every room she entered. And Sophie looked back at her without flinching and without performing, which was the only way Sophie knew how to be looked at. Then Lady Strathmere said, You have her song. Sophie said, I think it was always both of ours. The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the precision of someone who chooses words very carefully, Eleanor would have liked you, and this, from Lady Strathmere, in that room, was everything. Oliver, who had been waiting with the patience of a child who has been told to be patient and is counting the seconds, chose this moment to announce that he could read. He demonstrated on the spine of a book from the side table, Virgil, as it happened, which was somewhat ambitious, but the letters were large and he managed the title. Lady Strathmere looked at him with an expression that was, unmistakably, her daughter's expression, precise and private, the look of someone who has understood something a little ahead of everyone else. She said, Your mother could read at 4 as well. Oliver considered this information with great seriousness. Then he said, I know. Sophie told me. Lady Strathmere looked at Sophie. Sophie met her gaze and said nothing, which was also everything. They stayed 4 days. It was not easy. Grief shared between people who loved the same person does not become comfortable simply because it is shared. There were evenings that were too quiet, and moments when the children's faces caught a certain light, and everyone in the room felt the same thing simultaneously and said nothing. But there were other moments too. Oliver reading aloud from increasingly ambitious texts, while Iris corrected him in whispers. Tristan and Lady Strathmere walking in the frost-hard garden and finding, slowly, words for what had been wordless. Sophie sitting with the old woman by the fire in the evenings and being taught, quietly, the stories that the children would need to carry Eleanor forward in the way she deserved to be carried. On the last morning, as the coach was being made ready, Lady Strathmere took Sophie's hand briefly and said, "Bring them back in spring." Sophie said, "We will," and they did. Oliver and Iris de Leon grew up in that house, in that light, in the particular warmth of a family that had been broken and had been put back together, not by forgetting any of the pieces, but by finding someone patient enough to sit with them all. They grew up with Eleanor's songs, and Eleanor's grandmother's stories, and Eleanor's smile, which lived on in Iris's face. They grew up knowing what their father had cost, and what he had chosen, and what it meant that he had stayed. Sophie kept the shelf of books she had been given access to, and then the second shelf, and eventually the whole library, which was exactly the right size for a woman who had been reading borrowed things in corners for as long as she could remember. She read Pennant's British Zoology at least twice more, and marked pages, and taught Oliver the birds of the county by their calls, standing in the kitchen garden with their heads tipped back to the Wiltshire sky. The gravel, still, was always raked. But that was the gardener's. It had always been the gardener's. The Duke had stopped worrying about the gravel. He had better things to do. And that, dear reader, is how a song that no one could explain, sung by a woman no one had noticed, changed the shape of everything. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment below. New episodes arrive every week. Tell me, whose story do you want next?